White City Park Bridge, Centerville, South Carolina. As Centerville Road crosses over Interstate 80-5 and curves to the left, White City Park Bridge sits on the upper end of Lake Hartwell. Edward Bates and his wife were fishing on the lake when they heard a large splash coming from the White City Park Bridge. They decided to investigate. As they approached the bridge, they noticed items being tossed into the lake. Bloody sheets, a white baseball cap, a sweater, a deck of playing cards, broken dishes, a large garbage bag. Caution informed the couple to call the Anderson County Sheriff's Department. A deputy sheriff was dispatched to the White City Park Bridge. However, it was now dark and the items described by the Bates couple could not be readily seen in the darkened lake. The deputy sheriff informed the couple that police would properly search the area the following morning once the sun was up. The next morning, Anderson County Sheriff's Department dispatched Lieutenant Bobby Gambrell to the White City Park Bridge to investigate. As he approached the bridge, he spotted Edward Bates waving at him. As Lieutenant Bobby Gambrell exited his vehicle on the White City Park Bridge, he immediately noticed a dime, hair, a broken piece of bloody glass, and blood stains on the guardrail facing the Smith Hill side of the lake. Lieutenant Bobby Gambrell reached back into his vehicle and notified the Anderson County Sheriff's Department and the Townsville Rescue Squad of his findings. Within the hour, deputies began sealing off the crime scene on the White City Park Bridge. At approximately 1:30 on the afternoon of October 22, 1977, a nude male body was found floating under the bridge in Lake Hartwell. They also found a large gold Masonic ring floating nearby. Once the body had been pulled out of the lake, authorities noticed that the nude male body had suffered serious head trauma. There were numerous cuts and bruises on the nude body, with most of them concentrated about the face and left ear. Most significantly, the male body had a large dent in the back of the head. To the trained eye, it appeared as though two different weapons were used. The Townsville Rescue CRE retrieved the descendant's driver's license that was floating in the lake. The driver's license belonged to Harold Edward Whitfield, age 30, resided in Pendleton, South Carolina. Pendleton was a small town located 9 miles north of the White City Park Bridge. Who was Harold Edward Whitfield? Why was his nude body dumped into Lake Hartwell off of a narrow bridge? The horrific answers would reveal a crime so shocking that a community would be haunted by the revelations of lurid sex, brazen robberies, and violent actions, all caused by teenagers. Harold Edward Whitfield was born December 18, 1946. Harold lived in the Corinth community of Pendleton, Indiana, Anderson County, along with his wife, Vicki Diane, and his 8-year-old son. The couple married on December 7, 1968, when Harold was 22 and Vicki was 19. The young couple was viewed favorably by the community. However, Harold had a roaming eye and was very much attracted to an 18-year-old beauty, Terrie LuAnn Johnson Upchurch. Harold was also incredibly proud of his new 1977 white Pontiac Firebird Trans Am with a golden phoenix painted on the hood. Harold Co. owned a truck leasing company named Whitfield Trucking Incorporated with his father, Cullen Whitfield. The business was established in an old bank building at the intersection of Highway 76 and Sandy Springs Road in the Sandy Springs community. Directly across the street was the community post office. Several gas stations adorned the intersection as well. Harold prepared and set up deals for his drivers while his wife, Vicki, kept the company's book records. She worked from 10 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock in the afternoon on most days. Meanwhile, Terrie LuAnn Johnson, born January 6, 1959, was the only child of Murtis Melton and William Bill Johnson. The couple would divorce soon after her birth. Terrie LuAnn grew up in a working-class family in Welford, a small town west of Spartanburg, South Carolina. By the time Terrie LuAnn was 10 years old, her mother had remarried. Her stepfather was Ernest Melton, a native of Cherokee County. Terrie LuAnn's father also remarried and had 3 sons with his new wife. Terrie LuAnn was a poor student growing up and skipped school often. As a result, she became a truant youth. She was placed in the Willow Lane School for Girls in Columbia, South Carolina in 1971. She was 12 years old. She never had a loving relationship with her biological father or her stepfather. Only her mother, Myrtis, would visit on occasion. When Terrie LuAnn turned 17, she was allowed to leave Willow Lane School for Girls in 1976 after completing all of her high school requirements. Terrie LuAnn immediately moved in with her mother and stepfather in Spartanburg. Unfortunately, Terrie LuAnn did not fit in with her family's dynamic and found various restaurant jobs to avoid being around them. It was while working at the Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant in the fall of 1976 that Terrie LuAnn started dating Louis Upchurch, who was considerably older, and her store manager. Louis portrayed himself as worldly, having served time in the Navy and traveled all over the globe. Louis knew to win over Terrie LuAnn's family, he had to wait until she turned 18 to make any serious moves on her. So, 6 days after Terrie LuAnn's 18th birthday on January 12, 1977, Terrie LuAnn and Louis married. Afterwards, Terrie LuAnn quit her job and moved in with Louis, having accomplished her goal of getting out of her mother's home. Early into their marriage, the couple were each other's comfort. But since Terrie LuAnn only married Louis to get out of her mother's home, the cracks in their relationship started to show. They began to argue over Terrie LuAnn's obsession with 2 teenage boys named Frank Nathan Dunn and William Joel Jackson. Both teenage boys were in love with Terrie LuAnn and would hang out with her while her husband was at work. Within a couple of months, Louis transferred to another Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant located in Anderson, which was nearly an hour away from Spartanburg, with the hopes that this would force his wife from seeing Frank and William. Half-heatedly, Terrie LuAnn packed up her belongings and moved 60 miles away to Sandy Springs in Anderson County with her new husband. For a time, the distance worked. Terrie LuAnn sat around her home all alone in Sandy Springs with her pet bunny rabbit while her husband worked in Anderson. However, by early summer, once school was out, the allure of their marriage had lost its appeal. The arguments and insecurities grew, as it became more and more obvious that Louis could not control his young teenage wife. During one of their many arguments, Terrie LuAnn left home and was picked up hitchhiking by William, who had recently gotten his driver's license. Terrie LuAnn and William shared a hotel room for the next 2 days while Louis desperately searched for her. Louis contacted Terrie LuAnn's family in Spartanburg, but no one in her family had seen her or knew she was missing. William's mother reported her son missing when he did not report to work at his summer job. Terrie LuAnn and William returned back to Spartanburg after 2 days of sex and drugs. William's mother pleaded with her son to leave Terrie LuAnn alone since she was now a married woman. William, however, told his mother that he had planned to marry Terrie LuAnn after she divorced her husband. Unbeknownst to William, Terrie LuAnn was not looking to marry him, or anyone for that matter. She was simply wanted to be desired by a man when she felt her husband had neglected her by leaving her alone at home. She thought of William and Frank to a lesser degree, like brothers, despite having sex repeatedly with both of them. Deep down, Terrie LuAnn was attracted more to older men, probably as a result of the failed relationships she had with her own father. Terrie LuAnn eventually worked things out with her husband and returned to Sandy Springs in late summer. Of course, as far as Louis was concerned, the damage had already been done. Their second chance at love lasted a few weeks before Louis had given up on the marriage and left. He learned that Terrie LuAnn had continued seeing both William and Frank while he was at work. They often hitchhiked to Sandy Springs from Spartanburg every free chance they both had to be in her company. Terrie LuAnn Johnson Upchurch met 30-year-old Harold Edward Whitfield while walking barefooted from her Sandy Springs home to a small gas station located at the Sandy Springs crossroads. Terrie LuAnn did not have a telephone in her home and had to go to the telephone booth located outside the store. She wanted to call her husband, Louis, who was at work in Anderson, Indiana, and attempt to reconcile their relationship. Louis refused to accept her calls. Terrie LuAnn was about to walk back to her home when she spotted Harold's white Pontiac Firebird Trans Am parked in front of Harold's office. As she approached the vehicle, Harold noticed from inside the office and decided to step outside to converse with a teen girl. The two struck up a conversation about the appeal of the vehicle and the many perks the sports car had. Harold was trying his best to impress the teenage girl by trying to come across as cool for his age. He even offered to take her for a ride in his Trans Am. Terrie LuAnn, no doubt, was probably more interested in the sports car than Harold anyway. But then something clicked with the pair. In her desperate appeal to feel loved and desired by an older man after her older husband's rejection, accepted the offer with Harold. He opened the Epicenger door and Terrie LuAnn got in. Harold rushed back over to his driver's door and quickly got in. He started the sports car and revved the engine as the entire car vibrated. Terrie LuAnn giggled. Harold backed the sports car out of the parking lot and sped off down the country roads toward Terrie LuAnn's home. When they got to her home, Terrie LuAnn invited Harold into her home. Over the next few weeks, Harold would often drive Terrie LuAnn home whenever she walked to the store. Then they would spend time alone with each other in her home. With each interaction, the pair grew more and more intimate and more explicit. Friday, October 21st, 1977. Terrie LuAnn Johnson Upchurch started her day with only $62 to her name. $30 of that came from her mother in Spartanburg, and the other $32 came from her estranged husband, Louis. Her landlord indicted her to move from the residence. An Anderson County sheriff served Terrie LuAnn with a summons and complaint for eviction stating that she had only a few days to vacate the property. If not, a deputy would be back to physically remove her from the residence. The rent had not been paid since July, when Terrie LuAnn's husband Louis separated from her for good. Terrie LuAnn continued to reside in the home instead of moving back in with her mother in Spartanburg. Frank Nathan Dunn and William Joel Jackson also offered to help her stay in the house by selling soda bottles to come up with the back rent. However, it was not enough. Terrie LuAnn realized that she needed to come with some money fast. She decided that she would try hustling men for the money. She put on a flowery sundress and her pair of gladiator knee-high flat sandals. The temperature was quite mild for mid-October. She left her home along with her male companions, now roommates, Frank and William. They brought a small bag filled with soda bottles that they had planned to sell at the gas station at the Sandy Springs crossroads. As they approached the store, Terrie LuAnn walked across the street to the post office with the hopes that her family members had sent money in the mail to help her out. However, the postmaster was at lunch. She decided that she would try again later in the day. She then crossed over the street to rejoin Frank and William, who were in the process of selling their soda bottles to the store. The manager paid them $3 for the bottles. Frank and William immediately purchased cigarettes and exited the store. Terrie LuAnn walked over to the payphone to call her husband. Frank and William sat down next to her on the curb. Terrie LuAnn learned from a coworker of her husband that Louis no longer worked in Anderson and had accepted a transfer to a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant in Greenville. Devastated and unable to talk to her husband about the eviction notice, Terrie LuAnn was on the verge of crying. William Joel Jackson felt pity for her and offered to hitchhike back to Spartanburg to borrow the money from his parents. After a few minutes of waiting by the side of the road, someone stopped and picked him up. Terrie LuAnn and Frank walked back to her home. At her place, Terrie LuAnn and Frank sat around smoking cigarettes while pondering ways to come up with the back rent money. However, as the hours ticked on, they became more and more desperate. William returned empty-handed around 5:30 that afternoon. No one had the money they so desperately needed. Out of options, both William and Frank decided that Terrie LuAnn should go with her original plan of hustling men for money. She would lure a man back to the house, and Frank and William would steal the man's wallet and take his money while he was busy having sex with her. William would hide under the bed and Frank would hide behind the bedroom door. Terrie LuAnn was starting to get cold feet and thought her mother or sisters would come through with some money for her. She decided to go back to the post office once more before it closed. Frank and William were skeptical but agreed that if her family hadn't sent any money for her, that she needed to go with her original plan. Terrie slipped on her black velvet coat now that temperatures were starting to drop over her flowery sundress and walked out of the house. Frank and William watched from the window as she slowly disappeared down the long, winding country road. Harold Edward Whitfield returned home from his office around 6 o'clock that evening. His wife, Vicky Diane Whitfield, was about to start dinner when Harold entered the house. Harold was wearing blue denim jeans, a red Peterbilt jacket over a sweater with a white cap. Almost immediately, Harold received a phone call from Charles Syracuse, one of his drivers. Charles wanted Harold to return back to the office in Sandy Springs to fix him a haul lease for Saturday. Harold agreed and told his wife that he would return with takeout after setting up the hauling job at the office. Harold kissed his wife goodbye and left with another driver, John Luther Wardlaw, who needed a ride home in Central. John was working for Harold's father nearby earlier in the day. Both men returned back to Sandy Springs in Harold's Pontiac Trans Am. When they arrived at the office, John walked over to the store to purchase a 6-pack of beer, while Harold went inside his office with Charles to start the paperwork for his haul along with fuel permits and trip lease. Several minutes later, John returned to Harold's office with his 6-pack of beer. He told Harold that he saw an attractive young teenage girl across the street at the post office wearing a long black velvet coat over a sundress and knee-high lace sandals. John remembered giving the teenage girl a ride earlier that summer from the store to her home near Mount Zion Presbyterian Church. Harold smiled and excused himself as he walked out of the office to confront Terrie LuAnn outside. She crossed the street and sauntered over to Harold. Terrie LuAnn explained to Harold that she needed a ride back to her house and didn't want to walk back down the long country road in the dark. Harold agreed after he completed his haul lease for one of his drivers. Terrie LuAnn accompanied Harold back into the office, where he introduced her to both John and Charles. Harold grabbed a chair for Terrie LuAnn and opened one of John's beers to offer her. Terrie LuAnn accepted the beer, but never drank from it. She waited patiently while he finished up his haul lease with Charles. Both Charles and John continued to stare at the teenage girl, wondering how Harold, who was a married man with a child, had come to know her so well. Terrie LuAnn excused herself and went to the restroom. Moments later, when she exited, both John and Charles were gone. Charles had agreed to take John home instead of Harold so that he could have some alone time with Terrie LuAnn. She sat down next to Harold and the two began kissing when the office telephone rang. It was Harold's son, who wanted to know how much longer it would be before he came home with dinner. Harold explained to his son that he would be home in about 30 minutes, then hung up the phone. Terrie LuAnn asked if he was leaving right then, and Harold responded that he was not going home yet. They spent the next few minutes continuing to kiss. Terrie LuAnn finally stopped him to ask if he had any money on him. Harold told her that he did not have much on him at that moment, but that he could get some money for her if she needed it. Terrie LuAnn smiled and asked him to come back to her place. He agreed. The two walked out of the office as both John and Charles drove up in Charles's pickup truck. John said that he had left his work pants in Harold's Trans Am as he reached inside the car to retrieve them. Both men nodded to Terrie LuAnn before taking off back down the road. Harold walked her over to his sports car and opened the passenger side door for her as she got in. He closed the door. Then he walked over to the store to purchase 2 cases of malt duck beer wine. Seeing the beer purchase, Terrie LuAnn Harold if he was serious about giving her some money. Harold smiled and told her that he would move some money around for her on Saturday. On the drive to Terrie LuAnn's home, Harold mentioned to her that he had a friend that sold speed if she was interested. When the couple arrived at Terrie LuAnn's home, Harold was quite surprised to see 2 teenage boys at the home. Terrie LuAnn introduced Frank and William to Harold as her cousins as she placed the malt ducks in the refrigerator in the kitchen. Harold sat down in the living room with the 2 teenage boys. He nervously joked a bit before pulling out a handkerchief filled with several pills in it. Harold explained that they were downers and asked if they had ever used them before. Both Frank and William grinned, acknowledging that they had. Harold gave the pills to the boys and told them to help themselves to some of the malt duck. The boys entered the kitchen laughing as Terrie LuAnn briefly explained that Harold would give her the money she needed in exchange for sex and then closed the door to the kitchen. She dimmed the lights to the living room and turned on the radio in the corner of the room. She sat down next to Harold on the tiny couch in front of the coffee table. The 2 started kissing again as they shared a marijuana joint, drank some malt ducks, and slowed danced to a couple of love songs. Afterwards, Terrie LuAnn led Harold to her bedroom and closed the door to the room. Then she turned off the lights as they both undressed. Harold laid on her bed and asked Terrie LuAnn to perform oral on him. She refused, saying that it was not a part of their agreement. Harold grew angry and reminded her that he would not provide her with any money if she did not perform the act. He pushed her face toward his groin and tried to coax her into performing the act. Terrie LuAnn slapped him to get him to stop. Harold then forcibly grabbed her by the hair as she screamed at him to get his clothes and leave her house. William burst into the bedroom with a 2x4 board and began striking Harold with it. William struck Harold repeatedly in the back of the head with a blunt object as he was trying to get dressed. Harold turned around completely nude and shoved William against the frame of the bedroom door and told him that he would kill him. Then the 2 struggled with each other until they were fighting out into the living room. Terrie LuAnn turned on the light and saw that Harold had William bent backwards over the couch, choking him. William dropped the 2x4 board in a desperate attempt to remove Harold's hands from around his throat. Harold eventually choked William down the floor beside the couch. Frank ran out of the kitchen and shouted to Harold to just leave. Then he shouted, "You've gone crazy. You're killing him." Howard, however, would not let William go. Harold suddenly loosened one of his hands and struck Frank in the face above his eyes. Terrie LuAnn closed her bedroom door and started getting dressed. The whole situation had turned to shit. When she finally opened her bedroom door, now fully clothed, she saw that Harold, William, and Frank were still fighting. Frank had grabbed a plastic PVC drain pipe and was striking Harold repeatedly as he yelled for him to get his shit and leave. Terrie LuAnn closed her bedroom door once more and prayed for Harold to stop and just leave. Minutes later, Frank charged into her bedroom exclaiming that he thought he had seriously hurt Harold. Terrie LuAnn and Frank stepped out of the bedroom and saw Harold lying nude on the living room floor. He was motionless. Terrie LuAnn turned to Frank, who was also profusely bleeding over his left eye, and asked him if he had killed Harold. William was coughing and grasping for air as he made his way over to Frank and Terrie LuAnn. Blood splatter was all over the living room. Terrie LuAnn knelt next to Harold and saw the numerous bruises to his head, torso, and face. She checked for his pulse. He was still breathing. Frank raced out of the back door to the neighbor's home in order to call an ambulance for Howard. Unfortunately, the neighbor was not home. Terrie LuAnn suggested that they take Harold to the hospital in Anderson themselves. Frank moved the car around to the back door while Terrie LuAnn and William wrapped Harold in the sheets from Terrie LuAnn's bed. They then dragged Harold through the house and out the back door. Inside Harold's Trans Am, Frank climbed into the back seat with Harold and held his bloody head as he began gurgling from the blood filling up in his lungs. William started up the sports car, and Terrie LuAnn climbed into the passenger seat. They drove south on Highway 76 toward Anderson Hospital. As the closed on Interstate 85, Terrie LuAnn began to panic when she could no longer feel Harold's pulse. Harold was dead. William made a U-turn and drove back to Sandy Springs. All of their lives changed in that moment. Terrie LuAnn repeatedly screamed that she didn't know what to do. William calmly stated that they had to go back to Terrie LuAnn's house and clean up the crime scene and ditch Harold's car. Back at her home, the three teenagers cleaned up the blood in the living room as best they could with towels, detergents, and water. Then they gathered up all Harold's clothing along with the bloody sheets and towels and placed them in a trash bag. William suggested that they throw everything out at Big Bass Lake. However, when they drove there, they realized that Big Bass Lake appeared to be too open, so they turned the car around and drove out to another section of the lake off Centerville Road. When they crossed over the White City Park Bridge, William stopped the car. Frank grabbed the bag of bloody sheets, clothes, and towels from the trunk and tossed it off the bridge, while Terrie LuAnn and William dumped Harold off the side of the bridge into the lake. Inside Harold's Trans Am, the teenagers debated what they should do next. Terrie LuAnn finally broke down and cried. She shouted at William for causing all of their troubles to begin with. William sat in silence. Terrie LuAnn berated William, letting him know that she only had an argument with Harold and did not need for him to escalate things by hitting him with a wooden board. Now Harold was dead, and they would all go to prison. Then she remembered that Harold had introduced her to his drivers. They would surely go to the police when he didn't show up for work and give them her name. Shit. She was also pretty sure she had seen John Wardlaw before. And there was no doubt in her mind that Harold's wife would be calling the police once Harold did not come home. Fuck. Frank shrugged and said, I guess we can no longer stay in South Carolina. At her house, Terrie LuAnn wrote a note for her husband, Lewis, and tacked it to the front door. They filled the car up with gasoline using Harold's credit card that they had stolen and drove all night to Jacksonville, Florida. Frank said he always wanted to go to Jacksonville. They spent the next 3 days driving all over Georgia, Florida, and Tennessee using Harold's stolen credit card for gas, food, and lodging. The teens stopped at the Holiday Inn to rest and eat. After registering for their room with Harold's stolen credit card, the trio of teenagers proceeded up to their room 224. An hour later, a room service call was made for the restaurant adjacent to the motel from room 224. The restaurant ran the registered credit card on file for the room, and it came back stolen. The manager immediately contacted Madison County Sheriff J.B. Blackwell. The hotel manager waited until Sheriff J.B. Blackwell of Morgan County arrived with 2 of his deputies. The motel manager accompanied the police officers to the teenagers' motel room and knocked on the door. There was no reply at first. Seconds later, Frank opened the door. Frank lied and said no one else was in the motel room with him. The motel manager and the officers pushed Frank aside and entered the motel room. They found William hiding under the bed. Terrie LuAnn, meanwhile, had locked herself in the bathroom. She was making a loud commotion as she repeatedly flushed the toilet. After several knocks on the bathroom door by the sheriff, Terrie LuAnn finally exited the bathroom. The motel manager asked her if she would be paying for the motel room the credit card was declined. She informed him that Harold Whitfield would be paying for the motel room when he returned. The motel manager explained to the teenagers that if he didn't get the $23 for the motel room right then, he was turning all 3 of them over to the sheriff. Terrie LuAnn reached into her pocket and came out with all the money she had on her. It amounted to $22. She was $1 short. It was better than nothing. The motel manager accepted the money and then left the room to TPAY for the room at the front desk as the sheriff and his deputies continued to linger in the room with the teenagers. Minutes later, the motel manager returned with Terrie LuAnn's receipt. Then, he exited the room once more. Sheriff J.B. Blackwell stepped forward and informed the teenagers that the credit card they used had been reported stolen. He then arrested the teenagers. Back at the Morgan County Police Department, the three teenagers were separated and interrogated by Anderson County Sheriff Cooley in regard to the murder of Harold Whitfield. Terrie LuAnn immediately confessed, explaining that Harold Whitfield was killed by Frank Dunn and William Jackson in defense of her. She said she was invited by Harold to his office, where they flirted and drank beer before going back to her home to engage in sex. An argument erupted, and Harold ended up hitting her. Both Frank and William confronted Harold to defend her from an attack by Harold. Meanwhile, both Frank Dunn and William Jackson, in their own separate interrogations, contradicted Terrie LuAnn's statement. They both stated that Terrie LuAnn was supposed to lure a man to the house so that they could rob him. They needed money for drugs and to pay the back rent for Terrie LuAnn's home to avoid her having to be evicted. The plan, as they explained it, was for Terrie LuAnn to lure a man from the Sandy Springs crossroads and bring him back to her home. Then get the man in bed with her while they took his wallet. When Terrie LuAnn returned with Harold Whitfield, Frank took cover behind Terrie LuAnn's bedroom door with a plastic pipe, and William got under the bed with a wooden board. Terrie LuAnn and Harold entered the bedroom after spending several minutes of foreplay in the living room. The bedroom was dark. Neither boy could see what was happening. They could only hear Terrie LuAnn talking and making love in the bed. William tried to remove Harold's wallet from his jeans. Harold heard him. Harold hopped out of the bed and pulled William from under the bed. A fight ensued between the two that spilled out into the living room. Frank came from behind the door with the drain pipe and started striking Harold with the plastic PVC pipe. Frank struck Harold several times in the back of the head until he dropped to the floor. As Harold struggled to stand, Frank repeatedly struck him again and again and again and again until he was laying motionless on the floor. The teens were returned to Anderson County, South Carolina the next day after waiving extradition proceedings. Murder warrants were signed against each of them, and they were arraigned in front of Judge William Barnett in Pendleton. Bond was set at $210,000 for each teenager. They remained in custody in the Anderson County Jail until their trial. After their 4-day trial in late April 1978, the three teenagers were convicted in the murder of Harold Edward Whitfield after the jury deliberated for less than 3.5 hours. They showed no emotion as the guilty verdicts were read. Terrie LuAnn stared in disbelief. She believed that her self-defense claims would carry through to a not guilty verdict. The parents of the teens sobbed quietly in the courtroom. 24 hours later, Terrie LuAnn Johnson Upchurch, Frank Nathan Dunn, and William Joel Jackson stood before Judge Ballinger as he sentenced each teenager to life imprisonment with the possibility for parole in 20 years. Terrie LuAnn wept softly in disbelief. Frank stood sternly as the sentence was read. William also stood sternly, but he seemed more distraught and downcast than Frank. The only good news coming from their sentence was that neither of them would get the death penalty. Both Frank and William were granted parole after spending 24 years in prison. They were released October 19, 2001. Terrie LuAnn Johnson Upchurch was released on parole the summer of 2004.